We're now going to go to the section 2 of this roundtable, where we ask the question, how do we prevent pandemics from happening in the first place? Our first speaker is Dr. Niall McCann, who's the Director of Conservation at National Park Rescue and a co-chair of EndPandemics campaign, one of my colleagues. Dr. McCann, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Let me just share my screen. Take 2 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go. Right. And onto PowerPoint and play. So thanks ever so much, Steve, for the kind introduction. In the next few minutes, it will be my absolute pleasure to present to you an outline of the roadmap to end pandemics, which was created by the EndPandemics Campaign Alliance. The roadmap's already been delivered to ASEAN parliamentarians, and now, thanks to the convening power of the Vatican and the amplifying effect of Now Partners and The Independent, we can launch to a global audience. But before I get onto that, I think it's only right and proper that I introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Niall McCann. I'm a biologist and a reformed academic turned conservationist and broadcaster. I'm the Director of Conservation at National Park Rescue, co-chair of EndPandemics, National Geographic Explorer, and a trustee of the Royal Geographical Society. I spent much of my career in the frontline conservation, the media, and through lobbying, trying to convince people at all levels of society that wildlife matters as much to them as it does to me. But there's always been a barrier to entry, a disconnect between what scientists know and what is generally understood by the public and by policymakers. One of the reasons for this is that there's really very little understanding of what biodiversity is, or of the impacts that biodiversity and its loss or degradation has on human health, wealth, and well-being. Biodiversity is nature. It's the living planet. It's the birds in the air, the fish in the sea, the trees and the plants, and all other living things. Nature generates the oxygen we breathe. It cleans the water that we drink. It provides us with the food we eat. It regulates our climate. And as we are now so all painfully aware, it has a regulatory effect on the emergence of new infectious diseases. Over 50% of the world's economy is dependent upon nature, and yet our relentless exploitation of nature is driving irreversible climate change, causing catastrophic biodiversity loss, and increasing the frequency of new infectious diseases, including COVID-19, of course. We've known for some time that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all one health. That the more we degrade nature and impact upon the health of animals, including wildlife, the more we put ourselves at risk. But communicating this has always been a challenge. And then COVID-19 happened, and the world woke up to the fact that our treatment of nature has immediate consequences. We now know how pandemics start, as has been so eloquently described by my colleagues who spoke previously. We also know the cost of pandemics, as can be measured in dollars and cents, or more pertinently, in lives. The question is, how do we stop pandemics from starting in the first place? And it was with this question looming over us that the EndPandemics Alliance came together, united by the understanding that to reduce the risk of future pandemics, we must address their root causes and change our relationship with nature. This concept itself might sound a little nebulous, so we've gone to great lengths to be specific and have articulated a series of global solutions through our roadmap to end pandemics. The roadmap, which is already available in English, Thai, Vietnamese, and traditional and simplified Chinese, is a living interactive tool designed by EndPandemics for governments, corporations, civil society, and individuals, providing concrete, practical guidance on how to prevent the next pandemic. While much of the world is focused on rolling out vaccines to control the current pandemic, this roadmap provides a lasting vaccine, preventing future pandemics by addressing their root causes and investing in planetary health. The 4 key components of any effective pandemic prevention plan are reduce demand for wild animals, phase out commercial trade in wild animals, protect and restore natural habitats, and make our farms and food systems safer and healthier. We refer to these components as the 4 action pillars of pandemic prevention, and have begun to crowdsource effective solutions that address these pillars from within our own alliance. Reducing the demand for wild animals requires sustained behavioural change and awareness campaigns, as well as clear laws. These are cheap to implement, but they require political will and strong communication. But there are multiple examples of successful campaigns and laws that have had a net positive impact on public health. Just look at tobacco consumption and the use of CFCs in household appliances. From our own alliance, a strong example of this comes from ACT Asia, whose Compassion in Fashion program is helping drive awareness of the many issues in the fur farming industry, which came to a head this year, of course, with multiple COVID outbreaks in mink farms across the world and the complete closure of the fur farming industry in the Netherlands. Phasing out the commercial trade in wild animals is a huge task, riddled with caveats and complications, but it is vital. With around 40% of new infectious diseases coming from wildlife, our continued exploitation of wild animals is a public health catastrophe as well as a conservation catastrophe. Viruses don't discriminate between the legal trade and the illegal trade in wildlife. The legal trade must be restricted on grounds of public health and sustainability, and the illegal trade must be recognised as the serious organised crime that it is, and the policing of both trades must be properly resourced. It is, of course, vital that indigenous use and subsistence hunting be protected in any changes to legislation around the trade in wild animals, and that sustainable alternative sources of protein be sought wherever wild meat is a necessity rather than a luxury. Much of the progress that we need to make in phasing out the trade in wild animals lies within the law. And within our own alliance, the Conservation Litigation Team at Lancaster University have developed a powerful new method of applying liability lawsuits to convicted traffickers, making them criminally liable for repairing the damage their trafficking has caused to the planet. The protection and restoration of natural habitats is an enormous task, but absolutely critical for pandemic prevention and for the mitigation of climate change and biodiversity loss. Many developing nations already have vast areas of land nominally protected. So firstly, these areas need proper resourcing and effective protection. Secondly, we need this global protected area network to expand with a focus on supporting the role of indigenous people and local communities in conserving natural landscapes. A consensus is emerging around the CBD's proposal to protect 30% of land and marine areas by 2030. The key here is effective protection. And for effective protection, we need proper regulation and proper resourcing. Many of the advances in protecting nature will come from new legislation, with advances around the law of ecocide being particularly promising at holding people, businesses, and governments accountable for their actions. But laws are only as good as their enforcement, and the communities and rangers responsible for the stewardship of protected areas must be properly recompensed for their work. This means payments for ecosystem services to communities and equivalent incentives for law enforcement teams. From within our alliance, my own organisation, National Park Rescue, implemented a tokenised reward scheme that we call Sables to reward high performance in our staff, almost all of whom are recruited from local communities. The value of the token is doubled if it's redeemed for school fees or medical bills, explicitly linking the success of our conservation project with improved community access to education and healthcare, which has helped us achieve a 98% reduction in poaching in only 3 years. Overhauling the global agricultural system to make it safe and sustainable is another behemoth, requiring significant political will and resources, and yet it is vital. Agriculture is responsible for around 80% of global deforestation and 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is the top threat for 86% of at-risk species of plants and animals, and is associated with over 25% of emerging infectious diseases. Pesticide use, pollution, antibiotic resistance, and desertification are all driven by food production. And the FAO has called for transformative change in our food systems. We must divert agricultural subsidies away from industrial farming and into sustainable farming practices. We must support the 90% of farmers producing 80% of the world's food who are poor and who live at the interface between farmed and natural ecosystems to adopt agroecological practices, providing them with increased income and food security and reducing their impact on the natural world. We must reduce our use of antibiotics, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. We must change how and what we eat, moving to more of a plant-based diet and significantly reducing our wastage. All of these changes will come with massive ancillary benefits, and all must be made in collaboration with farmers, who must be supported through this transition. From within EndPandemics, the World Agroforestry Centre have had huge successes in introducing agroforestry techniques in Cameroon, transforming the lives of the communities involved, massively increasing local income and food security, or boosting biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and soil fertility. Most of these systemic changes come with upfront costs, but we know that these costs will be recuperated. And of course, they are dwarfed by the cost of a single wide-ranging pandemic like COVID-19. For us to meaningfully reduce the risk of future pandemics, all of us, at all levels of society, have a role to play. We must support frontline community actions. We must change public policies and laws. We must change business practices and change individual consumer behaviours, because individual decisions matter. It's not just systemic changes that will reduce the risk of future pandemics, but individual behavioural changes too. And EndPandemics have listed 11 simple things that each and every one of us can do to help pandemics. This roadmap is your roadmap, whether you're a member of Parliament or a member of the public. The impact of the Vatican's support for an effective pandemic prevention cannot be underestimated. It's an impact that could be multiplied were it to issue a directive that people become the custodians of nature, to care for creation rather than exploiting and destroying it. Through the Vatican's incredible reach from the high offices of state to the frontline communities living with the daily reality of the risks posed by the wildlife trade and unsustainable agriculture, this message and the roadmap to achieve it could be history-changing. The COVID-19 pandemic has been the greatest shared tragedy of our lifetime. We've all been touched by it, and now we must all come together to make sure it never happens again. And with that, I'll hand back to Steve.